Washington State University. Go Cougs!
Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to cover the first lesson of the Activity Change Detection module. We're going to discuss wearable devices such as the Fitbit and how we can collect data from the Fitbit API. Recently, many people are purchasing wearable devices in order to track their fitness and their health. One of the most common wearable devices on the market is the Fitbit. The Fitbit comes in many different models, as you can see here. Depending on which model you have of a Fitbit, there's going to be a different set of sensors in the device. Those sensors can include a triaxial accelerometer, an altimeter, a heart rate monitor, GPS, a compass, as well as an ambient light sensor. From these sensors, Fitbit collects data, and that data is processed to compute metrics related to physical activity and health. For example, from the triaxial accelerometer, steps and distance traveled can be computed. From the altimeter, floors climbed can be computed, as well as calories burned, heart rate, sleep, and location from the other sensors or combination of the other sensors. Today we're going to look at how we can download data from a Fitbit from the Fitbit API. Now, before we dive into the details of how to do this, I want to first note that if you have a Fitbit, like I do, I wear a Fitbit every day, then you probably already have a Fitbit account set up. If you have a Fitbit and you haven't set up a Fitbit account, please take the time to do so now. If you don't have a Fitbit and you don't have a Fitbit account, then please just follow along with the video, or perhaps consider getting a hold of a friend or a family member's Fitbit and Fitbit account so that you can follow along and learn how to use the Fitbit API. In future lessons where we'll be working with Fitbit data, I will be providing the Fitbit data in the form of a CSV file or several CSV files. So you do not need your own Fitbit data in order to follow along and work with Fitbit data in the Activity Change Detection module. However, in this particular lesson and the next one, it will be much more fun and interesting if you do have your own Fitbit and Fitbit account. So now let's talk about the Fitbit API. An API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it provides functions for programmers to use without knowing the details of the implementation. If we read the documentation for an API and we can figure out what format to communicate with the API and what response the API is going to communicate back with us, then we can essentially use an API like Fitbit. Some Fitbits require authentication, some do not. Fitbit is an example of an API that does require authentication. So we're going to spend most of our lesson today discussing how can we authenticate ourselves with Fitbit so we can use their API. An example of an API that is not authenticated is the Google Maps Distance Matrix API, which I include a link here if you are interested. So for those of you who are going to download your own Fitbit data from the Fitbit API, you're going to need to follow these 5 instructions that are set up by the Fitbit API documentation. So the first one, review the basics about how the Fitbit Web API works. I recommend you take the time to read this, as there are some important information that I will not cover completely in this lesson in this document. The second one is register your application to get API client credentials. You will need a Fitbit account to do this. So if you go to dev.fitbit.com, this is the homepage for developers for Fitbit, and click register an app. You'll have to log in, but once you log in, you can go ahead and make a new Fitbit app. When you set up the settings for your new Fitbit app, make sure to enter the following information so that it will work properly with the code we're going to derive today. So set the application type as personal. This is needed to access intraday minute-by-minute time series data for the owner of the app only, and the owner of the app is you, so that looks good. Set the callback URL to localhost port 8080. We will return to this page where you have your application registered and you're able to manage your application later. So go ahead and leave this tab open. Step number 3, implement an OAuth 2.0 authorization flow to allow people to give your app permission to access data on their behalf. Step number 4, make HTTP request to access data. So step 3 and 4, I'm going to walk you through in today's lesson and tomorrow's lesson. Today's lesson will focus on step 3, tomorrow's lesson, the next lesson will focus on step 4. Now, step 5, if you have a server app and want to be notified when people have new data available, implement the subscription API. We will not be covering the subscriptions API in this module. So once you've registered your application, the next step is to install the Python Fitbit client. So we're going to download some Python code from GitHub that's going to make working with the Fitbit API much more intuitive and much easier. So let's go ahead and follow this link here to GitHub, where we see the Python Fitbit repository. Go ahead and click Clone or Download, Download Zip. Go ahead and navigate to the folder where you downloaded that zip file. Here it is. Go ahead and extract that zip file, and then go ahead and double click on that extracted folder, and you should see some files and folders that look like this. Now we're going to open a command prompt if you're using Windows, or a terminal if you're using Mac or Linux. So to do this, in Windows, you can go ahead and hit your Windows key and start typing CMD and then press enter. If you're on a Mac or Linux, there are several ways you can do this. Open up Spotlight and you can go ahead and search for terminal and open the terminal. So I'm going to open up a new terminal, and using the cd command, we're going to navigate to that folder we just extracted. So mine is in Downloads. LS will give us a long listing of the files in that folder. There I see the Python Fitbit master folder. Navigate into it, and now I get a textual representation of that same folder we saw earlier with all of the files and folders for Python Fitbit. Now, the next step we're going to do is we're going to type some commands that's going to install some necessary requirements for running this Python Fitbit code. So the first one is pip install -r requirements. You may need to run this as administrator if you're in Windows, or on, depending on what Unix version you're using, as sudo. Okay, so I have successfully installed. Next, I'm going to install Fitbit, which was successfully installed. And next, I'm going to install CherryPy. And that is successfully installed. So far, so good. It looks like we have all of our requirements set up for running our Python Fitbit code. Now remember earlier I said to keep a tab open in your browser on the Fitbit page where you registered and set up the settings for your app. So if you don't have that open, you can go to dev.fitbit.com, click on Manage Your Apps, and then click on your app. You should see a page that looks something like this. Now, there's going to be some text here under OAuth 2.0 client ID and some text here under client secret, which I have removed so that you cannot see what my keys are, my secret and my ID, but you'll see some here. And you're going to want to go ahead and copy that text for each one of those and paste it in a .txt file so that your ID is on the first line and your secret is on the second line. Now, we're going to be writing some Python code that's going to read in the ID string and the client secret from this file. You may be thinking, well, why don't we just paste these ID and secret keys straight into our code? Well, I've added some text here and a link to say why that's a bad idea. So Google has a post called Best Practices for Securing Your API Keys, and the first bullet point reads, do not embed API keys directly in your code. If you want to read more about this, you can go ahead and click this link here. But this is why we're going to store our client ID and our client secret keys in a file external to our program, fitbitclientkeys.txt. You can call it whatever you would like. This is what I'm calling mine. I will not open up this file here because I do not want to share my ID and my secret. That is the point of keeping them in a separate file outside of the program. So once you've made this fitbitclientkeys.txt file, now we're going to go ahead and work on authenticating ourselves with our app to use the Fitbit API. So inside of the Python Fitbit master folder is a .py file called gather keys OAuth 2. So these keys we're going to gather are going to be the keys for our username, our user authentication. We'll get an access token and a refresh token. So go ahead and copy this file and move it into the same folder where you have your client ID, client secret keys in a text file. So mine are in Documents, GitHub, AHA, Lessons, and Files. So here's my fitbitclientkeys.txt. So I will paste this. I already have it in there, I'll overwrite it. So now my fitbitclientkeys.txt file and my gather keys OAuth2.py file are in the same folder. So now I have some code here that is going to import gather keys OAuth2.py as gather. It's going to open the fitbitclientkeys.txt folder, file. Change this to macpath/. It's going to read in the lines and extract the first line as the client ID and the second line as the client secret, and then it's going to create a OAuth 2 server object with the client ID and client secret called server. So I'll run this, looks good. Now, the next line of code here called server.browserAuthorize, this line of code is going to launch a browser and prompt us to log in to our Fitbit account. So we want to log into the same Fitbit account that we used when we created our app. That is the owner of the app. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And Fitbit login pops open. And I'm going to pause the video here while I enter in my login information. If you have successfully entered your credentials, then you'll see a page that looks like this. You are now authorized to access the Fitbit API. You can close this window. And just note the address up here in the URL is localhost port 8080, which is what we specified when we set up our app in the Fitbit developer website. So let's go ahead and close this and head back over to the notes. And we'll see some output here that we can ignore. We know that we were able to successfully log in. We saw this page. So now the next step is we want to get the user ID and the access token and the refresh token from our OAuth 2 server that we just authenticated by logging into Fitbit. So I'll run this code. Now we're going to use the user ID, access token, and refresh token with the Fitbit module to create a new Fitbit object, which will essentially be our interface to downloading data from the Fitbit API. So I'll run this code, passing in user ID, client secret, access token, and refresh token. Everything looks good. So now we should be able to make API requests with this Fitbit object, auth client. So let's try and gather some simple information about the user who we have authenticated, which is our own account. So let's use the user profile method and passing in this special string to get the information about the user. We'll get back a JSON object, which is like a dictionary, and we'll query the user's display name, and let's print it out. So for me, this is going to be Gina. And I get this from the Fitbit API because I've authenticated my account to be used with my app. And with the auth client reference, we're going to be able to make several calls to the Fitbit API to download data in a JSON format. And just using simple dictionary-like syntax, we can extract the fields that we are interested in. In the next lesson, we'll go ahead and continue this example by downloading minute-by-minute Fitbit activity data.